Thank you, everyone, for coming. Today, I think we have a real treat. We have a real treat today in our seminar. We have Lawson Brigham to speak with us today. And Lawson, probably I think a lot of you already know Lawson. He's a global fellow at the Wilson Center, and he's a researcher at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Now, Lawson has a storied career. As a U.S. Coast Guard officer, he commanded the icebreaker Polar Sea in both the Arctic and Antarctic expeditions on both sides of the world. Also chaired the Arctic Council's Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment some years ago, as I recall, but I still use some of those slides that he provided me with, Lawson. And Lawson got his PhD in polar oceanography from Cambridge University, and has focused his research on the Russian Arctic, in particular, polar marine safety and environmental protection. So if you want to find a guy who knows all about the Arctic and what is going on, Lawson is your guy. So please, Lawson, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to speak to you all at Ceres and NSIDC. I think I came to Ceres and NSIDC first time 1980 something or other, 89 maybe. I was at Woods Hole Oceanographic and on a fellowship for a year, and came out and met with Roger Barry and others then. So been a while, but I've been back since, of course, many times. This talk is about the Russian Maritime Arctic. I think Roger Barry would be happy. It's about geography, and it's eclectic, interdisciplinary. There's my title. There is great change, of course, everywhere in the Arctic, but extraordinary change in every dimension in the Russian Arctic, Russian Maritime Arctic. When I give these talks to many people who don't know as much as you all do about Arctic, I do kind of give an overview at the beginning of those 4 bullets that you see. I have to say, to everyone that there's extraordinary, profound, and rapid climate change, now 4 times the kind of change we have in lower latitudes. There's extraordinary globalization in terms of the connection of Arctic natural resources and the rest of the planet. Range of complex indigenous peoples' challenges and issues related to, the indigenous people trying to live in the 21st century and preserve their cultural heritage back centuries. And now, of course, not only is regional geopolitics and the Arctic Council, but now this war in Ukraine and the impacts on the geopolitics of the entire planet, but also, of course, at the top of the world. So that's lots of moving parts, lots of intersecting drivers of change, all at the top of the world. Next slide, Max. Yeah, here are the topics I'll try to cover. I'll try to get moving here. A little bit of geography, and of course, NSIDC people, folks, a couple use of your data and how I interpret it for the Russian Arctic, some new Arctic maps that we have in the 21st century, a little bit about resources and global links of the resources of the Russian Arctic to the world, a little bit about the Northern Sea Route, which I call the Russian Federation National Arctic Waterway, not really an international waterway, but the national domestic waterway. Some about the old Gulf and LNG and oil exports. Then I'll sum up with the factors influencing the Russian Maritime Arctic and its future. I have one slide at the end, and maybe we can have a discussion about the consequences of the Ukraine war on the whole of the Arctic and specifically the Russian Arctic. Next. I use this ICEBREAKERS map chart, the International Bathymetric Chart of the Arctic Ocean, because it's useful having the sea ice stripped away, because on the right side, of course, we can see the broad continental shelves that reach out from the Russian Maritime Arctic, the broadest, widest, most extensive continental shelves on the planet. So that helps to define somewhat this region. And you see the open nature of the islands that are north across the Russian Maritime Arctic, in contrast to the Canadian side on the left, and the really extraordinary complexity of the Canadian Arctic archipelago, and the supposed routes through the Northwest Passage and all of that. And you see Greenland, a couple dots there representing distances from up at the top, the Bering Strait, to the North Pole and out Fram Strait. If you're driving a ship, it's only 2,100 nautical miles. But that means that along the Russian Maritime Arctic, from the Pacific to the Atlantic, up in the north coast of Norway, is more than 3,000 nautical miles. And on the Canadian side, there are all kinds of different distances through the Canadian archipelago and the Northwest Passage, 8 different routes you can take, all about 2,600 nautical miles. So if you put the ice cover on it, those are long distances for ice-breaking ship, even nuclear icebreakers. So the distances across the Arctic are shorter maybe than other routes, but of course the place is partially or fully ice covered 6 to 8 months out of the year, even at mid-century and beyond, is the way I say it. There's greater marine access across the whole of the place, but quantifying it is the challenging thing. So the geography, I like this ICEBREAKER map because it tells a lot about the ocean. Of course, the telling factoid is that 68% of this place is marine and is ocean. And that's important to the geopolitics and to everything that moves and shakes at the top of the world. The North Pole, it's 4,000 meters down, 2 miles down. That's pretty deep, but 11,000 meters for the Marianas Trench. So a little less than half the depth of the greatest depth in the world's ocean, but nonetheless, 4,000 meters is quite deep. Next slide. Here's taken from you all at NSIDC. I like this chartlet, so to speak, 40 years of change in sea ice, because it tells us that it's on the Eurasian side that the retreat of sea ice has been greatest. Of course, it's retreated greatly in the Beaufort Sea, a little bit around Canada, but across the sweep of the whole of the Russian Maritime Arctic is the greatest decrease in ice extent here at the minimum extent at September. So that's, creates the specter and gets a lot of people thinking about access, transport, going ocean to ocean, destinational traffic. So this is a very valuable, slice of data comparison, mostly, of course, from September 80 in the satellite era, based upon, I guess, the passive microwave record. Next slide. And here is passive microwave from Illinois and the Cryosphere Today record of data. And I've just picked the two from 79 to 2012 minimum extent there. Again, just to highlight that it is across the Eurasian Arctic where this retreat has been most profound, but in the image on the right there from 2012, a historic retreat of ice from the north of Alaska in the Beaufort Sea out into the central Arctic Ocean. But again, really open area in September of 2012 across the whole of the Russian Arctic. Next slide. Here's your data again. I just John Walsh at UAF gave me this to use, and I use it in various classes, and then I have to explain that if we extend that blue line down to the x-axis, somewhere around oh, who knows where, 2038 to 2050, that line will intersect. And of course, for that instant in time, a day, well, hours, a day, a couple days, a month, the Arctic Ocean will in fact be ice-free at that day, likely in September of whenever. The very, iconic trend, very useful plot. Again, subset of data I've used just, again, 79 to 2020, but it's all there. But explaining the ice-free, what it means, ice-free, that the multi-year ice has disappeared, to a group that has no clue about this has been interesting, to say the least. Next slide. And for the diplomats in particular, and other senior people, I do have to remind them. I mean, it doesn't seem. It seems, a little crazy that you have to remind them that the place is actually ice covered. So I usually show these passive microwave images of the top of the world. This is 2020 again, to just remind everyone. And then, of course, people see the false color imagery and then they're all confused by that. But I say, look, the place is ice covered. And here it is from January to June. It looks like this today. There's some retreat around the margins of the ice around the basin, but it looks like this today. So the idea that it's ice free, sure it is in September, maybe, or will be. So anyway, I think and folks in various communities draw lines across the Arctic and proclaim trade routes. So when they're drawing lines across these kinds of images, I have questions about the kind of ship they're using and the time it will take to get across the more than 2,000 nautical miles at the top of the world. So you all know this stuff, but it's been interesting trying to explain the access to the rest of the world. Next slide. Just some new maps. You know of the 2011 Arctic Search and Rescue Agreement, which is maritime and aeronautical. And this is the agreed upon map that was negotiated. And you can see the great area, more than almost half of the Arctic, covered by the Russian Federation with regard to SAR in this case. But you also see, which is kind of quirky, that the airspace over Finland and Sweden, which are not Arctic Ocean coastal states, are also covered. At the beginning of the negotiation, I was there at the beginning, and it was really going to be a 6-state, including Iceland, and the 5 Arctic Ocean coastal states. And I said, well, what about the helicopters and the SAR equipment flying across the airspace of Finland and Sweden? So we did have an 8-state agreement in the end. Very fascinating. You can see the jigsaw puzzle of the map and the areas of responsibility. But again, it's an intriguing new map, geographic map of the top of the world. Next, another map coming up here. The International Maritime Organization over 20 years negotiated the Polar Code, a set of rules and regulations for ships in polar regions, the Antarctic and the Arctic. We have 60 South is the boundary that corresponds to the Antarctic Treaty application. But in the north, of course, it's a different ocean, and you have the North Atlantic Drift and the Gulf Stream and the warming of the waters and the retreat of sea ice on the right-hand side in the North Atlantic. So I worked on the team that drew the maps. We set 60 north in the Bering Sea, you can see to the left, and then we had this zigzag across the North Atlantic, north of Iceland, because Iceland itself didn't want to be under the Polar Code and have to have polar ships come there. And of course, they're ice-free, maybe 1 year out of a century. They're not ice-free, but generally ice-free. And so the historic retreat of sea ice is really, we correlated that historic retreat, or at least in wintertime, the advance of the sea ice in wintertime is our line that we have for the mandatory polar code that goes from around Greenland all the way north of the Kola Peninsula. The Russians didn't want the White Sea, although partially ice covered in the winter. They didn't want that under the polar code as well. So you can see this zigzag map, and within this, all commercial ships over 500 tons must adhere to the polar codes, mandatory polar code for all ships. So another controller, another type of geographic map. Next slide. And then just a little bit on the military situation here in the Russian Arctic. This is from CSIS and DC, one of their maps. But what the petrodollars have given the Russians, at least in the last decade or so, is the ability to refurbish their stations on Franz Josef Land, Severnia Zemlya, a little bit on the Novaya Zemlya, and also there's a big radar site now on Wrangel Island. And all of the funds, the federal funds to build long runways and capability. There are small stations with small garrisons, but nonetheless, new military capable. And of course, the Kola Peninsula on the left in the diagram is the really major military presence of the Russians, not only in the Arctic, but for global connections compared to, our place in Alaska with our air bases, our missiles in the ground, etc. So you can see the sweep of new capability in the Russian Arctic. There's, different disagreements on whether it's all defensive, some potentially offensive, the runways and the capability of long-range aircraft to fly to these islands and then fly across the Arctic. But most of it is likely defensive. Lots of people working on the issue of Russia's military posture in the Arctic. I'll focus more on the civil side. But again, another map of the Arctic focused on the Russian Arctic, Russian Maritime Arctic. Access to all of these bases is important. Use of the nuclear icebreakers and the capacity of the Russian fleet is integral to their operations along this part of the Arctic Ocean. Next slide. If we take a look at the connections of the economic connections of the Arctic to the planet, we see lots of resources. I've starred here what I think is kind of the connection of these resources to the Russian Arctic. We know that in the Arctic Ocean, in the Arctic, the two major fisheries on the planet are in the Barents Sea and the Bering Sea. Roughly 10% of world fisheries are in these two places, and the Russians have a niche and a share in both, in the Bering Sea and, of course, in the Barents, shared with Norway. It's in the mineral wealth where the Russians have the largest storehouse of hard minerals of any place on Earth. Roughly 10%. There's some question whether it's 20%, but roughly 10% of the world's nickel. You think batteries today. The world's largest producer of nickel is in Norilsk in the Russian Arctic. Getting the nickel plates out is done by sea, by rail to Dudinka, and then ships pick up the plates and carry them to world markets. Palladium, you can see 40% of the world's palladium, 15% of platinum, all in this place at Norilsk. Diamonds in the Arctic, and zinc, but zinc is 10% of the world's zinc is in Alaska. It's in the Red Dog mine, just as an example. Of course, hydrocarbons, the famous paper by the USGS decade plus ago showed that the top of the world is a gas province, and 30% of the world's undiscovered gas is located in the Russian Arctic, offshore and onshore, off Alaska, maybe some in Greenland. There's a question about that. And that the Arctic is there's really only about 13% of oil is at the top of the world above the Arctic Circle. But nonetheless, most of it's, if it's not in Alaska, it's in the Russian Arctic. All of it needs, Some of it's carried by pipeline, of course, gas and oil, but that's been changing, of course, this past year. Rare earths, coal, fresh water as a global commodity, lots of fresh water in the Russian Arctic, Greenland, Alaska. Another topic I see, Nature has a new journal on nature water. So I'm concocting a little paper, or at least commentary with some others on the water in the Arctic. And my interest area is, okay, how do you get that water to global markets? And of course, you do it by ship, not by pipeline. Tourism is another factor, the economic connection, and of course, regional trade and supporting northern communities is a huge economic enterprise. Next slide. A map from the Ministry of Natural Resources a couple of years ago, just to show you how the Russians themselves market this part of the world. It really is oil and gas, what they're talking about on this. They don't even show, they call it Natural Resources Reserve, but they're really focused, interesting to me, on, and rightfully maybe, natural gas and oil. You can see the Yamal Peninsula, the Ob Gulf, also a little bit further west in the Pechora Sea. You can see great stockpile, great resources and presence of natural gas and oil, at least in these regions, all either taken by pipeline to Europe, but today by ship. An interesting chartlet geographic map from in fact, the federal government. Next. A little bit more complex. You can't read all of the fine line there, but this is a consultant to the Russian government trying to put together in one map all of the resources offshore and onshore and identify all of these resources, hard minerals, oil and gas, particularly offshore, the leased areas, all in one composite map. I just find it interesting. And of course, it relates to shipping, relates to pipeline development, it relates all to Arctic development in this part of the world. Again, another map, another geographic synthesis, attempt at a synthesis. You can see Norilsk right in the middle there, and the large industrial complex there identified as it should be. Next slide. Here, go back. Thanks, Max. Yeah, maybe the most important slide in the whole set here is this map that Scott Stevenson, myself, and Larry Smith published and worked on. The Northern Sea Route, there's some confusion about the Northern Sea Route, even in definition. The Northern Sea Route by Russian law goes from the southern tip of Novaya Zemlya there, point 1, all the way to the Bering Strait. You can see the other straits. You can see the geographic, the bathymetric constraints. Some Sannikov Strait there, number 3, 13-meter draft will prohibit the sailing of most ships, large ships anyway. And Dmitry Laptev Strait, of course, is only 6+ meters. So those are not places where you can have normal maritime traffic. You can, of course, through Vilkitsky Strait, pretty deep, and that's where most of the traffic goes. But more traffic has been going north of the island groups, of course, because of this retreat of sea ice in the summertime. You can see the EEZ of the Russian Arctic stretches way out into the Arctic Ocean. You can see the boundary, the IMO polar code to the left, and then in the bottom right, you can also see it. But again, lots of constraints here, continental shelf, shallow depths along the Northern Sea Route. So the Northern Sea Route definition is very clear in Russian law. Very few people call this the Northeast Passage, but the historic name from ocean to ocean, from Bering Strait to northern Norway there, is in fact the Northeast Passage. I, for the past, for my work from the 90s, really have always called this the Russian Maritime Arctic, just to get around this these different definitions of. I mean, the world thinks the place is the Northern Sea Route, but the data if you use that definition, the data is cloudy and is confused, the data for transits, etc. Most of the transits, 1,000 of them, are really all cabotage and domestic. So this is important. The definitions are important. The geography of this region, the application of UNCLOS is important. All the boundaries, and then the declaring internal straits of the Russians cause all kinds of issues for all of us. And the control of shipping and individual ships within the EEZ, and the application of Article 234 of UNCLOS, which is the special sea ice clause, essentially, which allows the coastal state to apply marine safety environmental protection measures, and the Russians do that. Next slide. Just again a slice of data, and it's for January to June, 6 months time. So when you look at this data, it's all available at Nord University. The Russians data from the Ministry of Transport, and several Russian scholars work on this database and transfer it to Norway so it can be provided to the world. But if you take a slice of it, 6 month period of time I looked at, there are 71 ships on nearly 1,000 voyages in this region, mostly between the Barents Sea through Karagate and to the Yamal Peninsula. You can see all the types of ships: LNG carriers, oil tankers, of course, nuclear icebreaker voyages, and all kinds of ships, polar research vessel, tugs, barges, etc. So lots of ships that don't really get accounted for. It's all cabotage, it's all domestic traffic. The Northern Sea Route is used as a domestic waterway to move all kinds of ships along its net. The world kind of focuses on the trans-Arctic voyage, the ocean-to-ocean stuff, but really the place is used for domestic traffic. Very few full transits. The most recent one in 2022, the most recent data, there were 60 transits of the Northern Sea Route, but not all of them were ocean to ocean. Most of those transits were to Murmansk, which is, of course, still within, outside the boundaries of the Northern Sea Route, but within the boundaries of the Russian maritime Arctic. So very few trans-Arctic voyages today. If you compare it with the Suez Canal, it's about, I think last year, maybe 17,000 ships, and the Panama Canal, maybe 7,000. So we're talking just a handful of ships. The cargo tonnages, though, are ramping up, and I'll show you another plot, dramatically because of oil and gas. And so huge quantities of oil and gas are making up the tonnages of on board the ships that are using the Northern Sea Route and also exiting the Arctic Ocean. Next slide. Just a picture of a new nuclear icebreaker. In this case, the Arctica. The Russians have now 3 operating, a couple more to come, maybe even 7 of these ships in the future. Largest, most capable icebreakers in the world. Expensive machines. They really cost a couple $2 billion a piece, US dollars. Twin nuclear reactors, fewer crew members aboard, although I think they still have about 80 crew members, mostly engineers to keep the plant running. But extraordinary machines to mostly move traffic and assure access across the whole of the place for naval ships, for commercial ships, for whatever they want to do. They do some science, not much, but they do some science. As you know, the Arctic and Antarctic Research Institute has its own research vessels. But modern ships, lots of power, more power than any other icebreakers on the planet, and of course, unlimited endurance. The new reactors can last, presumably, the life of the ship. Anyway, next slide. And just as an aside, the floating nuclear power plant, this one was was built in St. Petersburg at the shipyard, towed around up across the Kola Peninsula to Murmansk, and then towed all the way across by icebreaker to Pivek in Chukotka in the eastern Russian Arctic. Very fascinating nuclear power plant to provide heat and light and power to the city of Pivek. The Bolivino power plant there has been shut down, and they plug in this nuclear power plant on a barge, essentially, nuclear power plant ship. It's named after, of course, Lomonosov, kind of interesting itself, but a not self-propelled, but a floating nuclear power plant. The Russians are planning more of these across the Russian Arctic. They'd like to sell them to other places in the world as well. But interesting application of technology, nuclear icebreakers. Here's a nuclear power plant on a barge, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide. Just an image to show you the size of a nuclear icebreaker, the Victory in World War II, one of the older type Arctic class. And then the new 300-meter, 1,000-foot LNG carrier. Again, extraordinary technology. These ships built in Korea, but it's all finished technology, but built in Korea. The ships are operated, except for one, the first 15. One is operated by Socomflot, the largest shipping company, state shipping company in Russia. All the rest are operated by international carriers. But the slide shows you that Mr. Putin and the government are driving this. They're declaring totals of cargo that the targets of the cargo, just extraordinary decrees, be like President Biden declaring how many ships might carry cargo through Bering Strait. I mean, that doesn't necessarily fit capitalism and the way the world works. But here again, it's old Soviet-esque in my mind, command and control of this part of the world. Next slide. Just an image of the new LNG, last 8 years, LNG facility on the Yamal Peninsula, LNG 1, essentially it's called. And these ships, these 1,000-foot, anybody that lives on the Great Lakes would know of the 1,000-foot ore carriers that come down from the Mesabi mines through the lakes. We used to escort those with Coast Guard icebreakers. I did for a number of years. But seeing a 1,000-foot ship, 300-meter ship in the Arctic is something else. Carrying LNG to Europe, still a few, mostly now headed into the Pacific from this location on the Ob estuary, on the Ob Gulf, western shore, carrying LNG to global markets. Next slide. Just a picture of one of these ships, extraordinary machines. Again, finished technology, Korean shipbuilders, international investment. So you see that all operating these ships in the Russian Arctic. The move afoot now is to have two large capacity store ships in and outside of Murmansk and in the Kamchatka Peninsula. These two ships will be anchored or pierside. The ice-breaking LNG carriers, these ships that can break about a meter of ice, these ships will go alongside these 2 points for transshipment. So they'll pump the LNG into these storage LNG container ships. Well, they're not containers, but they're tankers. and then non-ice going ships will come to these 2 transshipment points to pick up LNG and carry it to Europe and to mostly in the future to China and India, who are the buyers after the war in Ukraine. But extraordinary complexity of the ports and infrastructure. The whole reason for the transshipment is very clear. It's to keep these expensive LNG ice-breaking ships in ice in the Arctic Ocean, where they meet the polar code, and not be sailing around out in the open Pacific, where they have been now to Japan, Korea, and China, but to keep them focused on back and forth from the Yamal Peninsula to these transshipment points, and then other ships, other LNG carriers will carry it to the world. Next slide. Just a plot to show you the Soviet era from 1980 all the way through, of course, the end of the Soviet Union. Very low cargo tonnages, mostly hard minerals. Most of that tonnage along the Northern Sea was taken from Norilsk back to the smelters on the Kola Peninsula. All of that nickel, copper, iron ore, et cetera, all used in the Soviet defense industry and some domestic use, not connected to international markets. So today, all of this stuff, most of it, is going to world markets. So we see the ramp up beginning around 2015. Really, all those numbers, all that ramp up exponential growth is oil and gas coming out of the Russian Arctic along the Northern Sea route to global markets. Next slide. Just an image back 2018 to show you where most of the traffic was. Most of it was westbound out of the Amal to European markets or to off Norway for transshipment of LNG and oil. If you saw a plot today, very few ships headed to Europe because of the sanctions. A few LNG carriers still coming through because LNG hasn't been sanctioned. But most of the ships will be headed eastbound along the Northern Sea route to Bering Strait, and then principally to China, some to India. So just look, it's all international traffic, very few Russian flagships. It's all part of the global shipping enterprise. Next slide. Arctic LNG 2 is another plant on the eastern side of the Ob Gulf, being ramped up, being developed, even under sanctions. Novatech, the company driving this Arctic development, new set of ships to be built. But again, sanctions are hindering technological transfer and hindering the economic development of this new LNG set of plants offshore on the eastern side of the Old Gulf. But eventually, several of the sites will be developed. And again, ships will come to pick up LNG and carry it to the world. Next slide. Just another slide of the Old Gulf and the infrastructure. And this is all related to crude oil export, icebreakers, drilling rigs, offshore platforms. You can see that yellow crane-like fixture on the seabed. Seabed here is only about 20 meters deep, I think. And you can see it's sending oil. Oil comes out to this fixed structure and is pumped into tankers that come and are fixed to the rig there. And tanks are filled up, and again, they're off carrying crude oil out of the Russian Arctic to global markets. It's in the sun. This whole operation is in this and is year-round, ice covered, half the year. The ice is about 1.5 meters thick, so you need pretty big ships. You can see the size of the icebreakers, the ships that are being escorted in that image. In the southern part of the Old Gulf, way down south in quite far south in this long north to south estuary. And another slide next. A slide of the entrance to the port of Dudinka and the use of these ice-going carriers. What we call it, and this is a Finnish slide from my Finnish friends. Acor Arctic is the Finnish designer of these ice-breaking carriers, small container ships that carry nickel plate, sometimes copper and other metals, but they mostly carry nickel plate, refined nickel plate in small containers, and they can operate independently, have been now since 2004, almost 20 years. There are 5 of these ships that support the industrial complex at Norilsk, and quite extraordinary ship system, again, all developed for Norilsk by Nord Nickel, as it's called now, the company that is the industrial company and large taxpayer in the Russian Federation. Next slide. And I'll sum up here, and maybe we can move to some questions. just to give an overview, what's the future of this place? What are factors? And right at the top of the list, as you can imagine, is the profound climate change, not only increase in access, of course, in sea ice retreat, but of course, less access maybe on the land side. And we know about, I haven't talked about, of course, the extraordinary permafrost change, the wildfires in Siberia, et cetera, the 90-degree Fahrenheit temperatures in cities or a couple places in Siberia last summer. But of course, we all know the extraordinary and the connections of oil and gas prices, commodity markets on global commodity markets. But the great paradox or conundrum here is that the Russians at this time in history are developing oil and gas. It's very important to the national economy. And yet the rest of the world, we're trying to move towards renewables. And so what's the value, in fact, of coal? There's a new coal development in the Russian Arctic, and they're going to take that coal to India. So how long is that going to last? How valuable is these resources, these hydrocarbon resources, going to be that the Russian Federation rely on, not being a diversified economy? But anyway, climate change, huge issue, all kinds of dimensions as a factor in the development of the Russian Arctic. Access itself clearly increasing. As I said, terrestrial access is more limited, but the quantification of both of these axes are very complex, hard to do. What's the length of the navigation season is the real question. Next slide. Lots of other factors, but clearly the most important one of this region is the extraordinary wealth in Siberia and its importance to the GNP of the Russian Arctic, increasing from maybe 15% to maybe 30% in the future, or relying on hydrocarbons, hard minerals, maybe things like fresh water, et cetera. So there are huge consequences to this relationship of these resources to the Russian economy. We'll see how it plays out from 2040 to 2050 on through the century. The role of the central government, at least now with Mr. Putin in charge, very huge. I kind of think it's back to the old Soviet economy. But the twist is, as I say here, that this part of the world is connected to the global commodities markets and is connected to global shipping enterprise, whereas before it was all domestic and tightly held and really supporting the Soviet defense industry. So still government control, central control through taxation, through investment, etc. So very complex, but the role of the central government is the critical driver of critical factor in this part of the world. Next slide. Role of commercial industry. Well, there was a lot of development investment by international corporations in the last decade. Most of them have retreated, like Total in France and others, Shell and a whole host of Western companies, but most have retreated. The question will be what kind of investment will come to this area and be accepted by the Russians from China and India. A real wild card question. The Northern Sea Route really is a national Arctic waterway. There's no talk by the Russians themselves, well, maybe Mr. Putin and his ministers, but the folks in charge in Rosatomflot and in the Northern Sea Route and the Ministry of Transport, they never talk about, replacing the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal. They know better. They talk about how to facilitate this route to enhance the economic development of the Russian Arctic. So really it is mostly destinational traffic, as we call it, up and out to either tourism or these tankers go up into the Arctic, perform some sort of operation, and then come out of the Arctic. Very little trans-Arctic navigation. And of course, this waterway is related to naval operations and access for the Russian Navy. Next slide. Lots of unclose challenges, maritime governance in this area, lots of controversy, controls, internal waters. That's all overlaid on this part of the world. which we, the United States and Europe, deal with not only in Russia, but of course, the differences of opinion in the Canadian Arctic as well. You can see in some of my slides the role of advanced technologies, very fascinating application of advanced marine technologies to ice-covered waters. Next slide. The role of the Russian indigenous people, I think, are marginalized across the board. Don't need to say too much more about that, but having worked in the Arctic Council, you could see even the representatives of RAPON to the Arctic Council were controlled and marginalized. International engagement is a wild card today, now very limited. You can only meet up with the Russians really at IMO, WMO, IHO, the International Hydrographic, where they have a delegation. Of course, you know that the Arctic Council has paused. Next slide. And a lot of this relates to the history of the Soviet Arctic and its relevance today. There's a strong relationship, I would argue, not only in the Kola Peninsula, but across the whole of the region. It's just dominated by Soviet thinking. And although embedded with commercial development and capitalism and raising money and investments, there's a dose of clearly Soviet influence over the whole thing. The future is great uncertainty, as we know, with climate change, Ukraine, lots of wild cards, but the vast resources are still there. So there's no question that this part of the world is hugely important to the Russian Arctic. Next slide, and maybe I'll just will pause. Next slide. There are lots of consequences of this war in Ukraine, as you all know, and I've been following as well. I wrote an op-ed for The Hill, and I listed these 10, could have been 15, could have been 5, consequences of the war. And not only is the Arctic Council's future in doubt, cooperation is in science, as you all know, it's been tempered at least, and dealing with the Russians on every imaginable issue. Economic development has been influenced and disrupted across the planet. Energy markets, sanctions, you name it. And a renewed focus not only upon the Russians, but NATO for operations in the Arctic. In this whole mix of issues, there are great uncertainties and wild cards. The only certainty is the place is warming, I say, and that's the only certainty guaranteed. Continue warming, maybe continued access, huge issue for the planet, but that's really the only uncertainty. I'll leave it at that, and maybe we can have some discussion. Hopefully, we've got 10 more minutes. Last slide is just to ask questions, I think. Next slide. Thanks very much. Potpourri of stuff. Lots of maps, certainly geography. Hopefully useful to you all. Thank you.